the 5th of February 1946. Agana, Guam. The air, thick with salt and diesel fumes, clung to Eiko Tanaka's fatigues. Beside her, Setsuko, barely 16 and new to the work detail, flinched every time the American corporal's boots scraped the gravel. They were loading medical supplies onto a truck, the canvas flapping loudly in the morning breeze. Eiko watched the corporal, a young man named Evans, who rarely spoke, to check his clipboard. He seemed entirely focused on the inventory list, his pen scratching. This meticulous, impersonal attention had become its own strange ritual of safety. A stenciled sign on the depot wall read, "Work detail personnel. Maintain 3-meter distance. 1. When Setsuko fumbled a wooden crate, letting it thud heavily onto the loading dock, she froze, eyes wide with terror, expecting a strike or a scream. Evans merely looked up, his expression unreadable, and waited. Eiko moved slightly, partially shielding the younger woman. She kept her own gaze steady on the corporal, offering a short, respectful bow of apology for the delay. "It is all right," Eiko murmured to Setsuko in Japanese, low enough that only she could hear. "He is just counting." Evans grunted not in anger, but in acknowledgement, and ticked his list. "Next pallet," he ordered, turning away. The quiet procedure of the morning, the absence of expected cruelty, was a reality Eiko still struggled to process. These moments of humanity, found in the war's aftermath, often go unrecorded. 11760. 53. If this story matters to you, consider subscribing, and let us know in the comments what part of the world you are watching from. This fragile piece, however, was built on a foundation she could not have fathomed only 8 weeks earlier back at the main processing compound. 8 weeks earlier, Guam Processing Camp 4. The whistle cut through the pre-dawn chill, sharp and metallic. In the oppressive humidity of the barracks, Eiko Tanaka's hands froze. She had been crouched by her cot, working by the sliver of moonlight filtering through a gap in the canvas wall. In her lap lay her humiliation, her Imperial Army-issued boots, or what remained of them. The thick rubber sole of the right boot had separated almost entirely from the toe to the heel. Her work was desperate. She had salvaged threads from a discarded rice sack and, using a sharpened piece of wire found near the latrine, was attempting to stitch the sole back to the cracked leather upper. It was futile. The leather was too brittle, the thread too weak. Around her, the barracks stirred. The sounds of women coughing, limbs stretching stiffly on wooden cots, the rustle of thin blankets. These were the other nurses, the civilian aides, the women captured when the island fell. Eiko's solution had been rags. She tore strips from the hem of her own ragged undershirt and packed them tightly into the gap, hoping to create a cushion, a defense against the sharp coral gravel of the compound. She then wound the precious sack thread around the outside, binding the boot together in a crude, desperate repair. It would not pass an inspection. It would barely hold her weight. This was her central terror. Not the guards, though the propaganda had prepared her for Oni blue-eyed devils who would inflict unspeakable horrors. The reality of the Americans, so far, had been loud, chaotic, and mostly indifferent. No. Her terror was this simple, daily inspection, the morning roll call. She shoved her foot into the contraption. The rags bunched painfully under her arch. It felt unstable, precarious. She pulled her thin blanket smooth, her movements economical, practiced. A soldier of the Emperor does not show weakness, her supervising surgeon had told them, months ago in a field hospital that smelled of gangrene and smoke. Dignity is your final armor. Her armor was made of rags. The shame burned hotter than the tropical humidity. She feared the moment a guard would see. She envisioned the laughter, the inevitable, brutal mockery as she was pulled from the line, exposed before everyone. The whistle shrieked again, closer this time. Tenko. Roll call. Aiko stood, testing her weight. The ruined boot held, but barely. She could feel the damp ground through the sole. She fell into line with the other women, shuffling out onto the packed earth of the compound. The air smelled of mud and the distant, acidic tang of the latrines. Floodlights cast long, intimidating shadows. Aiko kept her eyes down, focusing on the back of the woman in front of her. She practiced how she'd stand. Weight shifted subtly to the left, the right foot tucked slightly behind, hiding the evidence of her failure. A sergeant, broad and imposing, emerged from the mess hall, clipboard in hand. He began to walk the lines. Aiko focused on her breathing. She could not fail here. She could not be seen. The boot, and the dignity it represented, was all she had left to protect. The lines were formed. 5 rows of women, standing in the damp chill that always preceded the Guam sunrise. The floodlights bleached all color from the compound, turning their patched uniforms a uniform gray. Aiko stood rigidly, her entire consciousness focused downward, into the millimeters of separation between the damp earth and her right foot. She had mastered the stance. Left foot bearing 90% of her weight, right heel slightly elevated. The toe of the ruined boot tucked just behind her left ankle. It was a posture of feigned normalcy that screamed tension. The gravel crunched. Sergeant Miller. He was not a large man, but his presence seemed to suck the air from the space around him. He carried his clipboard like a weapon not of violence, but of damning, bureaucratic power. He started at the far end of the first line. Aiko listened to his progress. The heavy, measured tread of his boots. The occasional sharp, monosyllabic query in English, a language she understood only in fragments, mostly commands. Name? Number? Show me. He was methodical. This, Aiko had learned, was more terrifying than random brutality. The propaganda had promised monsters. It had not prepared her for indifferent, thorough accountants of war. A monster you could defy. An accountant you simply failed to satisfy. He was in the row in front of hers. Aiko watched his shadow move across the ground. She forced her gaze forward, toward the wire fence at the far end of the compound. Looking down, looking away, looking anywhere but straight ahead, was a sign of guilt. He stopped. He was directly in front of the woman to Aiko's left, a quiet woman named Hisei. Canteen, Miller said. Hisei fumbled, unclipping the metal canteen from her belt. Her hands trembled violently. Miller took it, unscrewed the cap, sniffed the contents, and handed it back. A standard check for contraband, forsake or stolen alcohol. Aiko did not breathe. Miller's gaze, she felt, was sweeping sideways. He had not moved on. He was standing between Hisei and Aiko, looking at his clipboard. She could feel the boot. The packed rags inside were compressing, the separated sole scraping the ground. Do not look down. Do not look down. If he looked down, he would see the unnatural bulge of the string wrapped around the instep. He would see the gap at the toe. He took one step to his right. He was now directly in front of Aiko. She stared over his shoulder, her heart a cold stone in her chest. This was it, the moment of exposure. She prepared her face, bracing for the inevitable order to step forward, to lift her foot. The silence stretched. Aiko counted 5, agonizing heartbeats. Then, the crunch of gravel behind her. He had moved on. He had passed her. He had not looked down. A faint wave of nausea, the sharp backlash of adrenaline, washed through her. She locked her knees to keep from swaying. The inspection continued down the line, but Aiko heard nothing. She was hollowed out, consumed by the simple, overwhelming fact of her temporary survival. Group 4. Kitchen detail. Aiko was in Group 4. She broke formation, moving with the small cluster of women toward the mess halls. At least, she thought, the kitchen meant wooden floors. It meant she could sit. The boot had survived one more day. The kitchen was a fog of steam and noise. Large metal vats bubbled with boiling potatoes, filling the air with a thick, earthy smell. Aiko's job was simple: scrubbing the wooden floorboards with a coarse brush and a bucket of gray, soapy water. It was grueling work, but she welcomed it. It allowed her to be indoors, away from the guards' direct line of sight. More importantly, it offered opportunity. The kitchen was a place of supplies, sacks, twine, discarded rags. She scrubbed methodically, her eyes scanning the periphery, her gaze fixed on a stack of burlap potato sacks near the pantry. Beside them, coiled like a dormant snake, was a thick roll of jute twine. It was perfect, strong, durable. It would hold her boot together for weeks. She edged closer, the sloshing of her bucket masking her movements. "Do not." The voice was a sharp whisper at her elbow. It was Emmy, another nurse from her ward, who was peeling potatoes nearby. Emmy's eyes, normally soft, were wide with warning. "They will not miss a small piece," Aiko whispered back, keeping her head down, scrubbing. "You do not know that," Emmy hissed. She leaned closer, her knuckles white on the peeling knife. "In the men's compound," Masuda-san told me. "They shot a man. For one pack of cigarettes. They left him in the wire as a warning." Aiko froze, the brush still in her hand. A cold dread, sharper than the morning's fear, settled over her. Shot. For cigarettes. This matched the propaganda perfectly. The radio broadcasts, the leaflets dropped on their hospital unit before the surrender, all depicted the Americans as undisciplined animals who killed for sport. "They will show you no mercy," the political officer had warned. "They do not follow the codes of honor." Aiko looked back at the twine. It was only 10 feet away. Her gaze shifted to the American guard standing at the kitchen entrance. He was young, barely 20, with a rifle slung loosely over his shoulder. He was not watching them. He was reading a small, dog-eared paperback book, his lips moving slightly. He looked tired. He looked bored. Was he the type to shoot a woman for a piece of string? The contradiction was paralyzing. The rumors from Emmy spoke of monsters. The man at the door was just a boy with a book. The risk was too great. Emmy was right. Aiko turned away from the pantry, her heart heavy. She would not take the twine. She would have to find another way. She plunged her brush back into the bucket and attacked the floor with renewed, frustrated energy. As she worked, the soapy water splashed over her feet. It soaked through the gaps in her ruined boot, dissolving the tightly packed rags she had stuffed inside that morning. She felt the sodden pulp collapse, the sole beneath her foot detaching completely. The water, cold and dirty, seeped into her thin sock. Aiko stopped, her breath catching. She had tried to protect the boot, and in her caution, she had destroyed its last fragile repair. She looked down. The boot was no longer just damaged. It was visibly ruined. The sole gaped open like a mouth. There was no hiding this. Emmy's warning had saved her from a potential punishment, only to deliver her to a certain humiliation. Tomorrow, at roll call, Sergeant Miller would not pass her by. He would see. Rain began to fall just after midnight, a heavy tropical downpour that hammered against the barracks' corrugated tin roof. The sound was deafening, isolating each woman in her own world of noise and darkness. Sleep was impossible. Aiko sat upright on her cot, her thin blanket pulled around her shoulders. She did not try to sleep. She was engaged in a vigil. In her lap, held with a strange, detached reverence, was the right boot. It was beyond saving. The soapy water from the kitchen floor had dissolved the last of the packed rags, leaving a sodden, foul-smelling pulp. The sole, now completely detached, lay beside it like a separate, dead thing. There was no string, no thread, No desperate act of repair that could fix this. Tomorrow, she would walk out onto the compound yard, and every step would announce her failure. She would stand in the line, and Sergeant Miller would see. She thought of the propaganda. The leaflets had warned of rape, torture, and execution. But her immediate reality was not that. Her reality was a bureaucratic indifference that demanded functional equipment. Her fear was not of death, but of being reduced to an object of pity or scorn. She, Eiko Tanaka, a nurse trained to save lives and maintain sterile fields, could not even maintain her own footwear. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Her father, a stern man who valued propriety above all, inspecting her shoes before she left for school each morning. "Precision, Eiko," he would say, tapping the polished toe. What did her spirit reflect now? She felt a tightening in her throat, the familiar burn of tears. She refused them. Crying was a luxury. It was a weakness the Oni would feast upon. She had seen Emmy's terror, the whispered rumors. If they shot men for cigarettes, what did they do to women who cried? No. She placed the ruined boot and its detached sole carefully on the floor beneath her cot. She would not hide it. She would not limp or shuffle or attempt the pathetic posture of yesterday. Her decision settled over her, cold and clear as the rainwater. She would walk out tomorrow with her head held high. She would stand in the line. When Sergeant Miller stopped, she would look him in the eye. She would not beg. She would not show shame. She would accept the punishment, whether it was a blow, a day in confinement, or public ridicule, with the discipline she had been taught. She was a nurse of the Imperial Army. Her dignity was the last thing she controlled. She lay back on the cot, the sound of the rain enclosing her. The fear did not disappear, but it changed. It was no longer a panicked scrambling for solutions. It was a cold, hard acceptance of the inevitable. She finally drifted into a shallow, fitful sleep, her mind steeled for the morning. It came too soon. The rain had subsided to a light drizzle, but the air was heavy. The shriek of the whistle cut through the gray dawn. Tenko. Eiko swung her legs over the side of the cot, and taking a sharp breath, slid her foot into the boot or what was left of it. Walking from the barracks to the compound was an exercise in controlled agony. The rain had turned the gravel into a sharp, muddy paste. With every step, the loose sole of Eiko's right boot flapped uselessly, slapping against the ground. Stones bit into the thin fabric of her sock, sending sharp pains up her ankle. She refused to limp. She kept her chin up, her gaze fixed on the gray horizon. Just as she had resolved, she could feel the eyes of the other women, some curious, some pitying. She ignored them. She took her place in the second row. She planted both feet firmly on the ground, making no attempt to hide the ruined, gaping boot. The cold mud immediately oozed through the gap, engulfing her toes. It was done. There was nothing left to do but wait. The compound fell silent. Sergeant Miller emerged, his boots immaculate, his clipboard shielded from the drizzle by a clear oilcloth cover. He began his inspection. His progress felt faster this morning, more clipped, as if the rain annoyed him. He moved down the first row, barking a few corrections, and then turned to Eiko's row. He started at the far end. Eiko listened to the approaching cadence. Crunch, crunch, pause, crunch, crunch, pause. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird in a small cage. She focused on the wire fence. Do not flinch. Do not look away. You are a nurse of the Imperial Army. Crunch, crunch, pause. He was in front of her. The air grew heavy. She could smell the damp wool of his uniform and the faint, foreign scent of his shaving soap. She did not look at his face, but stared directly at the breast pocket of his fatigues. She felt his gaze drop. She felt it. A physical weight. moving from her face, down her uniform, to her feet. The silence stretched. It was no longer the tense, passing silence of yesterday. This was a focused, final silence. This was the moment. Aiko closed her eyes. She braced for the shout, the rough hand grabbing her arm, the order to step out. Nothing. She opened her eyes, confused. Sergeant Miller was still standing there, looking at her feet. His expression was not angry. It was not mocking. It was annoyed. It was the look of a man confronting a logistical problem. He grunted, a sound of exasperation, and then looked past her, down the line. "Harris!" he yelled. A young private at the end of the line snapped to attention. "Sir." "Tool." "Size," Miller ordered, gesturing vaguely toward Aiko with his clipboard. "Sir," the private replied, and quickly jogged away toward the supply shed. Aiko's mind raced, trying to parse the English. Tool? Size? It made no sense. This was not the sequence of events she had prepared for. The propaganda had not supplied a script for this. Miller did not seem to be treating her as a human, but neither was he treating her as an animal to be tormented. He was treating her like a piece of broken equipment. He stepped back, moving on to inspect the woman next to Aiko, tapping her canteen impatiently. He had dismissed her, but left her standing in place, her fate unresolved. A minute later, Private Harris returned. He was carrying a strange object, a flat plank of metal with sliding levers. Aiko had never seen anything like it. He stopped a few feet away, glancing at the sergeant, who merely nodded toward Aiko before turning to mark his clipboard. The private, looking deeply uncomfortable, approached Aiko. He held up the metal tool. Private Harris looked acutely uncomfortable. He was perhaps 19, with pale skin that was peeling on his nose, and he seemed desperate to be anywhere else. He glanced at Sergeant Miller, who was busy marking his clipboard, and then back at Aiko. He motioned with his head. "Step out." Aiko's heart, which had briefly quieted, resumed its frantic pace. This was it. The public spectacle. The sergeant was too important to handle the humiliation himself. He had delegated it to this boy. She stepped out of the line. The mud pulled at her ruined boot, making a thick, sucking sound. She stood before Harris, awaiting the first command, the first laugh. She expected him to order her to dance, or perhaps to hop on one foot. Instead, Harris crouched, not kneeled, not yet, and placed the metal tool on a relatively flat patch of gravel. He pointed at it. "Foot," he said. Aiko stared at the device. It was clean, metallic, precise. Her boot was covered in filth, the sole flapping, her sock soaked in mud. She hesitated. To place her foot on that object felt like a profanity. She did not understand the order. Harris sighed, a sound of profound impatience. He looked at the sky, as if praying for strength. Then, he did the unthinkable. He dropped to one knee. Aiko flinched, a sharp intake of breath. An American soldier was kneeling in the mud in front of her. The act was so contrary to the laws of victor and vanquished that her mind simply stopped. This was not the posture of a conqueror. This was not the setup for a joke. Harris did not look at her face. He kept his eyes fixed on her feet, his expression grim, purely focused on the task. He was not engaging with her. Aiko Tanaka, the enemy nurse. He was dealing with a problem, her boot. "Foot," he repeated, his voice flatter. He reached out and tapped the toe of her ruined boot with his finger, an impersonal touch. "Here." Numbly, mechanically, Aiko lifted her right foot. She expected him to recoil at the filth, to curse. He did not. He carefully guided her foot onto the metal plate, his fingers briefly brushing the broken leather. The cold of the metal measuring device bit through her wet sock. It was a sharp, clinical sensation. Harris's movements became economical. He slid the rear bracket until it touched her heel. Click. He slid the side lever to measure the width. Slide. He squinted at the small, stamped numbers on the device. He pulled a small, waterproof notebook and a stub of a pencil from his shirt pocket. He wrote down the numbers. Then he stood up, brushing the wet gravel from his knee. He looked at her, not at her face, but at her collarbone, and nodded once. A short, sharp gesture of completion. He gestured with his head back toward the line. Aiko stepped back, her foot sinking into the mud again. Her mind was a void. She had been prepared for cruelty, for malice, for rage. She had not been prepared for this, the cold, indifferent, efficient logic of a shoe fitting. Sergeant Miller, having finished his list, barked the morning assignments. Group 4, kitchen detail, move. The lines broke. Aiko stood frozen for a second longer, the sensation of the cold metal still imprinted on the sole of her foot, before the woman behind her bumped her forward. The kitchen was, once again, a haven of steam and mundane noise. But today, Aiko felt no relief. She was scrubbing the same pots as yesterday, but the world had tilted slightly off its axis. She felt the eyes of the other women. Yesterday, they had been united in their shared misery. Today, she was different. She had been singled out. She had been measured. The whispers followed her from the potato bin to the wash station. Why her? What did they measure? Did you see him? Neil? Aiko scrubbed, her knuckles raw, keeping her head down. She understood their fear. In their world, any deviation from the norm, any special attention from a guard, was dangerous. It marked you. It meant you were either an informer or you were being fattened for a special kind of slaughter. The propaganda had taught them that kindness, especially from an American, was merely the prelude to a more sophisticated cruelty. She was isolated. The other nurses gave her a wide berth, afraid that her strange predicament might be contagious. She tried to focus on the work, on the scouring pad scraping against the aluminum pot, but her mind kept replaying the scene. The click of the metal measuring device, the damp gravel on the private's knee, the utter lack of emotion on his face. It was illogical. A beast does not measure its prey's foot. A monster does not kneel, unless in mockery, and there had been no mockery. There had only been procedure. A cold, inexplicable, bureaucratic procedure. She had been braced for a blow, and instead, they had brought her a ruler. The anticlimax left her feeling hollow, unmoored. The waiting was worse than the punishment she had expected. Every time the kitchen door opened, every time a guard's boot scraped the threshold, she tensed, believing they had returned to finish whatever strange ritual they had begun. She was rinsing a large pot when Emmy approached, carrying a crate of turnips. Emmy did not look at her. She set the crate down heavily, her back to Aiko. For a moment, she just stood there. Then, quickly, without turning, Emmy's hand reached back and pressed something small and hard into Aiko's palm. Aiko's hand closed around it by reflex. It was a crust of bread, saved from the morning's meager ration. Before Aiko could react, Emmy had picked up her empty crate and walked away. Aiko stared at the spot where Emmy had stood. It was a gesture of profound risk. Emmy had broken the isolation. She had seen Aiko's terror and responded not with suspicion, but with solidarity. Aiko quickly slipped the crust into her pocket, her eyes stinging. The small piece of bread was an anchor, but the central mystery remained, unsolved. The image of the metal measuring device was burned into her memory, a symbol of an enemy she profoundly misunderstood. The day dragged on, each hour tightening the knot of suspense in her stomach. The whistle finally blew, signaling the end of the work shift. Aiko wiped her hands, her dread returning. They would be marched back to the compound. Back to Sergeant Miller. Back to whatever fate the measurement had decreed. The walk back from the kitchen was a blur. Aiko's mind was so consumed by the morning's event and Emmy's small act of kindness that she barely registered the path. She was simply swept along in the shuffling crowd of women. They rounded the corner of the mess hall, and the compound came into view. Aiko's steps faltered. Standing near the entrance to their barracks, unmoving, were Sergeant Miller and Private Harris. Miller held his clipboard. Harris stood beside him, holding something in his hand. A pair of something. The group of women slowed to a collective halt, the murmuring instantly silenced. The two American soldiers, silhouetted against the weak afternoon sun, seemed like arbiters of fate. Aiko's stomach hollowed out. The waiting was over. Tanaka, Aiko. Sergeant Miller's voice was flat, impersonal. It was not a question. Aiko's legs felt like lead. She separated from the group, stepping forward into the open space. The other women watched, holding their breath. Emmy was among them, her face pale. Aiko stopped 5 feet in front of the sergeant, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. Assuming a position of attention, she stared at his chest, awaiting the sentence. Miller did not speak. He simply nodded at Harris. Private Harris stepped forward. He still looked uncomfortable, his eyes averted from hers. He was holding a pair of heavy, dull, brown leather work boots. They were not new, they were clearly reconditioned, but they were solid. The laces were thick, the soles made of hard, black rubber. He extended them toward her. Aiko stared at the boots, then at his face, then back at the boots. She did not move. This was impossible. This was a trap. There was no logic for this. "Take 'em," Harris mumbled, shoving them slightly closer. Slowly, hesitantly, Aiko raised her hands and took the boots. The weight surprised her. They were heavy, solid. The leather was stiff, treated with some kind of waterproofing oil that smelled faintly of chemicals and pine. They were the most substantial things she had held in months. She looked down at her own feet. At the ruined boot, gaping open, caked in mud, the sole barely attached. Then she looked back at the solid, functional, whole objects in her hands. This was the tool they had measured her for. Her mind struggled to find a category for this. It was not kindness. Their faces showed no kindness. It was not cruelty. There was no mockery. It was efficient. They had seen a broken piece of their labor force, and they had replaced the part. They had done it with the same impersonal energy they would use to fix a truck tire or replace a shovel handle. The propaganda had not warned her about this. It had not warned her about an enemy that would ignore her humanity, but precisely, meticulously care for her feet. Miller made a check mark on his clipboard. "See that they fit." He turned and walked away. Private Harris, relieved, immediately turned to follow. "Try them," he said over his shoulder. Aiko stood alone in the middle of the compound, holding the new boots. The other women began to move again, shuffling past her into the barracks, whispering, glancing back at her and the objects in her hands. Aiko entered the barracks and walked to her cot, the heavy new boots held tightly to her chest. The other women watched her, their whispers ceasing as she passed. She sat down, her back to them, creating a small, fragile wall of privacy. She placed the new boots on the floor in front of her. Then, she reached under the cot and pulled out the ruined boot and its detached sole. She set them side by side. The contrast was absolute. On one side was the ruined boot, waterlogged, caked in mud, the leather split, the sole a useless flap of rubber. It was a symbol of her past, of her service, of the imperial army that had demanded everything from her, and, in the end, left her with nothing. It was her shame. On the other side were the American boots. They were solid, functional, and utterly foreign. The leather was thick, the stitching robust. The rubber soles deeply treaded. They smelled of oil and industry. They were the property of the Oni, the barbarians. To put them on felt like a betrayal. The teachings of Bushido, drilled into her as a nurse and as a citizen, were clear. Death was preferable to dishonor. Surrender was the ultimate shame. To accept a gift from the enemy, to wear their uniform, even just their boots, felt like the final, contaminating act of submission. It was an acknowledgement that her captors were now her providers. She looked at her bare, mud-stained feet. The gravel rash, from the morning's walk to the compound, stung. She thought of tomorrow's roll call, and the day after, and the work details, stretching into an indefinite future. Was it betrayal to survive? Was it dishonorable to have dry, protected feet? Her conflict was not about comfort. It was about identity. Slowly, deliberately, she picked up the right American boot. She unlaced it, pulling the thick laces free. She slid her foot inside. Her breath caught. It fit. It did not just fit. It fit perfectly. The arch was supported. There was no pinching at the toes, no slipping at the heel. It enveloped her foot with a precise, engineered security. She remembered the cold touch of the metal measuring device, the private's impersonal focus, the numbers he wrote in his notebook. It had not been a random act. It had been calculated. She put on the left boot. It, too, was perfect. She laced them both, her fingers fumbling with the thick, stiff laces. For the first time in months, she was stable. The solid rubber soles connected her firmly to the wooden floor. There was no wobble, no pain, no fear of a sole flapping loose. The sheer, practical logic of it overwhelmed her. These men, whom she had been taught to see as savage, emotional, undisciplined animals, had addressed her problem not with rage or mockery, but with a measuring device. They had applied technology and logistics to her feet. The propaganda, the image of the leering, brutal American soldier, began to crack. It did not shatter, but a fissure appeared. Barbarians did not care about a prisoner's correct shoe size. She shoved the ruined boot and its sole deep under her cot, out of sight. The next morning, at Tenko, Aiko Tanaka stood in the second row. She stood tall, her feet planted firmly in American boots. Sergeant Miller walked the line. He stopped in front of her. His eyes dropped to her feet, noted the new boots, moved back to his clipboard, and he walked on. The 5th of February 1946, Agana, Guam. 8 weeks had passed. The rains had subsided, replaced by a dry, relentless heat. Aiko was no longer in the processing camp. She was part of a permanent work detail assigned to the rebuilding of Agana, the island's capital, which had been pulverized by the American bombardment. She stood on a loading dock, her feet planted firmly. The American boots were well broken in now, the leather creased to the shape of her ankles, the soles scuffed but solid. They were, she acknowledged, the finest footwear she had ever owned. Her assignment today was loading medical supplies onto a truck bound for a civilian dispensary. The guard supervising them was a Corporal Evans, a quiet young man who rarely spoke and seemed entirely consumed by his inventory lists. A stenciled sign on the depot wall read, "Work detail personnel. Maintain 3-meter distance." It was a rule, like any other. Aiko was now one of the senior nurses, and the newer arrivals looked to her. Beside her, Setsuko, a 16-year-old aide who had been captured only weeks ago, was trembling. Setsuko was still in the grip of the terror Aiko remembered so well. She saw monsters everywhere. They were loading heavy wooden crates of bandages and sulfa powder. Setsuko, her hands clumsy with fear, fumbled a crate. It slipped from her grasp and thudded heavily onto the loading dock floor, spilling none of its contents, but making a sharp, damning noise. Setsuko froze. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with the expectation of a blow. Corporal Evans looked up from his clipboard. His gaze was neutral, assessing. He looked at the crate, then at Setsuko, then back at his list. He waited. This was the moment. Setsuko was trapped in the old world, the world of propaganda, expecting the Oni to strike. Eiko watched the corporal. She saw no anger. She saw no malice. She saw only what she had learned to see: procedure. He was waiting for the work to resume so he could continue his count. His silence was not a threat. It was just a pause in the logistics. Eiko moved slightly, partially shielding the younger woman. She offered a short, respectful bow to Evans. An apology for the delay in his inventory. "It is all right," Eiko murmured to Setsuko in Japanese, her voice low and steady. "Daijobu. He is just counting." Setsuko looked at her, confused by her calm. Evans grunted an acknowledgement of the pause and ticked his list. "Next pallet," he ordered, turning away to count the boxes already on the truck. Eiko bent down, helping Setsuko right the crate. As they lifted it together, Eiko realized the nature of the weapon that had truly defeated her. It was not the bombs, nor the battleships. It was this. It was the overwhelming, impersonal, inescapable logic. It was the power of an enemy that would not bother to hate you, but would, with meticulous precision, ensure you had boots that fit